Snow was falling heavily across the desolate mountains, where no soul ventured during the harsh depths of winter. A reclusive war veteran, living alone in an old ranger outpost near the canyon, had expected nothing more than a quiet night by the fire. But then, through the whiteout, came the unsteady sound of hooves and a faint, broken whinny that sounded eerily like a cry for help. When he stepped outside, the sight froze him in place. Two wild Mustang horses, trembling and exhausted from the cold, were staring at him, not with fear, as if they were begging. He couldn't have known that opening the gate that night would set into motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. A journey where compassion, survival, and the fragile bond between man and wild would be tested to the very edge. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story touches something in you, don't forget to subscribe. Snow had been falling non-stop for days across the remote canyon lands of Wyoming. By early evening, it blanketed every surface and muffled every sound, transforming the entire landscape into a silent, white desert. The old ranger outpost, where Caleb Hart had taken residence, sat on a slight rise overlooking a narrow gorge. Its pitched roof sagged under accumulated drifts of snow, and the corrugated tin used for repairs years ago had begun to rust, leaving orange streaks across the otherwise dull gray. A solitary line of gnarled pine trees stood off to one side, their branches snapping under the weight of ice whenever the wind gusted. The hush in this place was so profound that the quiet felt almost alive. Every small crackle of ice or shudder of timber became magnified. Caleb's outpost had once served as a minor lookout station for forest rangers, perhaps decades earlier. Now it was little more than a neglected cabin, with a drafty roof and old boards that groaned at night. Where the front steps met the ground, there was a perpetual ridge of packed snow. It half buried an antique no trespassing sign, rusted and illegible in places. Caleb had chosen this distant spot after a personal crisis, one he hadn't shared with anyone. Here, time seemed suspended, except for the howling of the wind. It was as though the world had simply paused, giving him space to be alone with his thoughts. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee grounds. A battered wood-burning stove stood in one corner, the fire within popping and hissing as it consumed split logs. Caleb had stacked a generous supply of these logs along the inside wall, anticipating that the storm would continue through the night. Outside, a gust rattled the window panes, and the door gave a soft moan as if complaining about the cold. Despite the comforting crackle of the stove, the outpost felt lonely. Caleb Hart was nearly 40, though the lines at the corners of his eyes and the streaks of gray in his hair might have made him look older at a casual glance. He was a former serviceman. People might call him a veteran, but he never used the word for himself. Years spent in uniform had given him a disciplined air. Even in solitude, he maintained a systematic routine, splitting wood each morning, checking his meager supplies, and tuning in to an old radio in the evenings to catch the local weather bulletins. Sometimes, that radio was his only link to the outside world. A large dog, a shepherd mix named Boone, lay curled near the stove. Boone was old, with a muzzle turned white by age. He'd been by Caleb's side through the last stretch of his military service and beyond. The dog seldom stirred these days unless he sensed something unusual, be it an unexpected sound or a shift in Caleb's mood. That night, Caleb set a kettle on top of the stove to heat water for coffee. The forecast crackling over the radio predicted more snowfall and colder winds after midnight. Nothing unusual for a Wyoming winter. He turned the volume down low, letting the radio's static become background noise. Gazing through a small frost-rimed window, he could see only swirling flakes in the darkness. The reflection of his lantern on the glass reminded him how alone he was out here. Alone, but at peace. That was what he'd told himself time and again. He was just settling onto a three-legged stool with a cup of coffee when Boone's head jerked up. The dog's ears pricked, and a faint growl rumbled in his throat. Caleb set his mug down. "Easy, boy," he murmured, rising to his feet. He reached for the radio dial and twisted it silent. The hush of the cabin was immediate and absolute, save for Boone's low growl and the wind outside. At first, he heard nothing. Then came a muffled, rhythmic thumping, an uneven crunch of steps on snow. Not human footsteps. These were heavier, more widely spaced, and uncertain. Caleb felt an unexpected jolt of adrenaline. He crossed the room in 3 strides, parted the threadbare curtains, and peered out the window. The layer of frost clinging to the panes made the view hazy, so he wiped it with the heel of his hand. Boone followed at his heels, uneasy. In the wavering glow of the cabin's outside lantern, Caleb caught a glimpse of movement near the dilapidated fencing that outlined an old livestock pen. Through the swirl of snow, he thought he saw something that shouldn't be there, some shape large enough to be a deer or even a moose. Yet the sound that reached him a second later was unmistakable. A whinny, faint and tremulous, as if from a horse pushed beyond its limits. "Impossible," he whispered. Wild horses never ventured this close to solitary outposts, especially in the depths of winter. But another whimpering whinny confirmed it. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He grabbed his coat from a peg on the wall and slung it on in a hurry, then reached for the doorknob. Boone gave a short bark, uncertain whether to follow or stay. "Stay here," Caleb said quietly, pressing a hand to the dog's flank. Boone's ears flattened for a moment, but he stayed put. Outside, the cold was breathtaking. A fierce wind whipped snow into swirling eddies around Caleb's boots. He shielded his face with one gloved hand as he trudged along the side of the outpost. Each step sank him at least halfway up to his shins. The last time he'd seen conditions this bleak, it was on a late patrol day overseas. Only now, the war zone was replaced by the silent cruelty of a Wyoming winter. A soft metallic creak drew his attention. The old fence a few yards away was half broken, with warped planks that hardly functioned as a pen anymore. Beyond it, he could make out 2 dark silhouettes. One was distinctly larger, while the other, smaller form, stood with its hindquarters trembling. The pair seemed to sense his presence, turning their heads in near unison. Dim light from the outpost lamp reflected in their eyes. Caleb moved closer, keeping his motions slow and deliberate. Sure enough, there stood 2 Mustang horses, one a fully grown adult, with a soaked mane that clung to its neck. The other was smaller, possibly a juvenile or yearling. The smaller one's hind leg was partially buckled, and its stance was unsteady. Both animals breathed in rapid plumes that condensed in the frigid air. He stopped at the fence, gripping the top rail, unable to tear his gaze away. Mustangs weren't typically known to approach human dwellings, let alone linger by them. It was as if desperation had overruled their usual instinct to flee. The adult Mustang flicked its ears forward and back, uncertain, while the younger one let out a feeble snort, then nearly collapsed onto its front knees before catching itself. Caleb's mind raced. "They're freezing," he thought, scanning their bodies for any signs of injury. The younger horse's hind leg was trembling badly. He guessed it had either sprained or fractured something, or perhaps the muscle was severely cramped from hypothermia. The adult wasn't in much better shape, ribs faintly visible, coat matted with snow. Stunned, he felt a pang of concern so intense it stung worse than the wind biting at his cheeks. This land was harsh, but seeing these proud, untamed creatures so near to collapse stirred something within him. A mix of empathy and an old soldier's impulse to save what could be saved. Back in the relative warmth of the outpost, Caleb stood by the stove, fighting an internal battle. He'd rushed inside after first glimpsing the Mustangs, needing a moment to think. Helping wild horses was generally discouraged unless one was trained or had the resources. Wild equines belonged out on the range. Intervening could mean drawing them into human territory, and that wasn't always in their best interest. But the image of that younger horse stumbling, eyes glazed with fear and exhaustion, replayed in his mind over and over. He wanted to ignore it. He was no veterinarian, no ranger. He also recognized the enormous risk. If those Mustangs decided to spook or thrash in panic, he could be injured. Yet something in him refused to let the situation go. "Damn it," he muttered. He removed his coat for a moment to warm up again, letting the stove's heat seep into his limbs. Boone stared up at him, tail thumping faintly, almost as if the dog sensed his turmoil. "You think it's a bad idea, don't you?" he asked. Half smiling at the dog, Boone merely tilted his head. Caleb had been taught all his life, and especially in the service, that you didn't abandon those who needed help, no matter how dire the circumstances. He had once assisted in training cavalry horses during a deployment. Marveling at their intelligence and sensitivity, horses knew how to read a person's demeanor by the smallest shift in posture or tone. And these Mustangs, though wild, wouldn't be so different. The question was whether they were too far gone to accept any approach. A muffled clattering outside snapped him from his thoughts. That uneasy sound of hooves hitting old, rotted wood. Possibly the younger horse had stumbled against the fence. Caleb's heart clenched. He stood, pushing aside all second-guessing. If he did nothing, the younger Mustang could die right there in the snow. The adult might wander off or remain out of desperation, further endangering both. He found himself sliding into his heavy winter jacket once more, securing the straps of his boots. This time, he grabbed a worn canvas sack containing some hay he kept for occasional pack horses that passed through. He also took an old oil lantern and a thermos of warm water. "All right, let's do this," he breathed, stepping into the frigid darkness again. As he approached the dilapidated fence, he could see the Mustangs more clearly. They hadn't moved far. The adult horse stood protectively in front of the smaller one, ears pinned back slightly as Caleb neared. He raised the lantern so the light would fall on his face, hoping they would see his expression, his calm posture. The snow battered his shoulders, swirling across the ground in ghostly sheets. He unlatched the old gate that led into what was once a livestock pen. The hinges squealed in protest. The adult Mustang snorted, tossing its head, but didn't charge or flee. Caleb held out the canvas sack, which rustled with hay. "Easy there," he said quietly. "It's all right. I won't hurt you." The younger horse tried to shift its weight, whimpering softly. Another pang jolted through him. In the flickering lantern glow, he noticed how gaunt the yearling looked, its flanks almost hollow from malnutrition. Slowly, with minimal sudden movements, he carried the hay into the pen. He set it down a few yards away from the Mustangs, then backed off to give them space. The adult horse, evidently weighing the options, finally led the younger one forward to sniff the hay. Satisfied it wasn't an immediate threat, the adult let out a huff that seemed to say, "We'll eat, but keep your distance." Caleb exhaled in relief. He quietly edged closer to the gate, ready to secure it and funnel them farther into the pen, which included a three-sided lean-to near the corner. That lean-to might offer them some shelter from the wind if they'd accept it. The adult Mustang raised its head, looking uncertain, but didn't bolt. Taking this as a sign, Caleb reached over and gently closed the gate behind him. They were now enclosed together in that small pen, the once sturdy wooden enclosure on the cusp of total disrepair. Snow drifted in from every open slat, but at least here, the wind's force was a fraction of what it was in the open field. Caleb let the lantern rest on a post, free to cast a warm circle of light over the trodden snow. The adult Mustang continued to stand guard, occasionally glancing at Caleb. The younger one devoured the hay in a half-starved frenzy, even as its injured hind leg kept buckling. Guilt and pity churned in Caleb's stomach. "I'll get you some blankets," he murmured, voice trembling in the cold. "And water. Just hang on." A little while later, Caleb returned with a thick wool blanket, additional hay, and the small first aid kit he used for his dog. The kit contained some veterinary ointment, bandages, and disinfectant. Boone trotted behind him until he reached the fence, where Caleb told him to sit. The dog obeyed, posture alert but calm. Stepping inside the pen, Caleb found that the younger horse had curled up on the ground near the lean-to. The adult stood just behind, half sheltered by the wooden overhang that offered minimal protection from the swirling snow. The wind had momentarily died down, leaving the air eerie and still. It was as if the storm held its breath, waiting to unleash more fury at any moment. Lowering himself to a crouch, Caleb inched closer to the younger horse. At the same time, he kept an eye on the adult, If the older Mustang interpreted any action as a threat, a single well-aimed kick could break bones. The adult snorted, shifting its weight as though preparing to intervene. But Caleb kept his movements slow and unthreatening. He gently placed the blanket on the younger horse's back. It shivered at the touch, letting out a pitiful, low whine. The adult stepped forward, sniffing the edge of the blanket, then let out a warm breath. For a moment, it looked like the older Mustang might tear the blanket away, but it didn't. Instead, it seemed to accept that whatever the human was doing might be helpful. Caleb focused on the injured hind leg. By lantern light, he saw that the leg was swollen near the hock, though no fresh blood indicated an open wound. Possibly a severe sprain or pulled tendon. The skin around the joint felt hot to the touch, maybe an infection or a strain that had gone untreated for too long. "Shh, easy there," he whispered, sliding off one of his gloves to apply the ointment with more precision. The yearling grimaced, eyes rolling back a bit, but didn't lash out. Its breathing was labored, each exhale trembling. It took several minutes to finish the makeshift bandaging. His hands were nearly numb by the time he secured the final piece of cloth with a strip of duct tape. The adult Mustang pressed closer, sniffing this new contraption. Then it shifted, almost as if trying to block the wind from the younger horse. Caleb stood back on numb feet, both relieved and anxious. These were wild creatures, typically. A Mustang in good health would never allow such proximity. Their acceptance of his aid underscored how desperate they truly were. The younger horse gave a quiet grunt as it settled its head onto a pile of hay, the blanket draped over its withers. The adult lowered its muzzle to nudge the bandaged leg, then gently touched its nose to Caleb's arm, an accidental brush or maybe a brief sign of acknowledgement. "Guess you're not the only one looking out for that young one?" "Huh?" Caleb said softly, meeting the adult's dark gaze. He felt the strangest flicker of connection, like he and this Mustang were partners in an unspoken pact to save a life. A hush settled over the pen. The wind started to pick up again, swirling snow around them. But within this small enclosure, there was a surprising sense of calm. Caleb withdrew, giving them space. He set some extra hay within reach, then quietly left the pen, latching the gate behind him. The adult Mustang watched him go, ears rotating as though listening for any threat or betrayal, but none came. Back inside the outpost, he shook off the snow and stoked the fire, adding fresh logs. Boone padded up and licked a few remnants of frost from his sleeve. It struck Caleb that he was physically shaking, as much from adrenaline as from the sub-freezing temperatures. He inhaled slowly, letting the warmth of the stove sink into him. He found himself replaying the image of the yearling's leg, the gratitude, real or perceived, in the adult Mustang's eyes, and the question that swirled through his thoughts. Where is the rest of their herd? Evening wore on. The storm seemed to intensify yet again, wind howling across the canyon. Inside the outpost, the soft glow of lanterns and the crackle of the stove provided a measure of comfort. Caleb brewed a second pot of coffee, though he knew he shouldn't drink too much this late. It helped keep him awake and alert. He wanted to monitor the Mustangs outside, perhaps check on them once more before he called it a night. The outpost windows were streaked with rivulets of melting frost. Each time he wiped a patch clear to look out, he saw the faint silhouettes of the horses near the lean-to. Their breaths created plumes of steam in the cold air. The adult sometimes paced in place, but it never strayed far from the younger one's side. Caleb had placed a lantern on a nearby hook to give them a bit of light, enough for them to see the layout of their immediate surroundings and not stumble blindly. His mind drifted to earlier years, a memory locked behind the walls he'd built around himself. He recalled being about 12, living in a rural town with a large corral behind the house. His father had introduced him to a quarter horse named Sunshine. She was gentle, and he'd ride her around the paddock. That was before he'd left for the army, before life had hammered him down. He let the memory float through him. Bittersweet. A snort outside broke through his reflection. He pressed close to the window, peering out at the swirling whiteness. The lantern's glow illuminated the adult Mustang's shoulders, revealing rivulets of melting snow trickling down its coat. The younger horse appeared to be lying down, blankets still mostly in place. It wasn't the best shelter, but it was something, given the circumstances. Setting aside his coffee, Caleb walked to the door, checking that it was unlatched in case he needed to run out quickly. Yet for the first time in years, he felt no pressing need to lock himself away. Usually, he would secure every window and door, but now something about having those two living souls nearby soothed him. He let out a quiet laugh at the thought. Imagine that. A pair of wild Mustangs in his yard, making him feel less lonely. He decided to give them a final look before turning in. Bundling up once more, he pulled on thick gloves and stepped out into the storm with a gentle hiss of breath. The yard was a maze of snowdrifts. Each footstep sank him up to his knees. He was halfway to the pen when he paused, hearing a soft, resonant nicker from the adult Mustang. It was not an alarm call, more like a low greeting, or perhaps a notice of his presence. He raised his lantern, letting its light spill over the fence. The adult Mustang turned its head toward him, ears pricking forward in recognition. The yearling, still curled under the lean-to, lifted its muzzle briefly, then settled again. The injury must be painful, but at least it wasn't thrashing or standing on the wounded leg. Caleb took this as a sign of small progress, that the horse felt safe enough to rest. He carefully approached the gate, making no sudden moves. "How are we doing?" he asked softly, feeling a bit foolish for speaking to them as if they could answer. But it felt natural in this hush of night. The adult Mustang's breath came out in short bursts, visible in the cold air. It stepped aside, allowing him near the yearling. "Thanks," Caleb murmured. He saw the bandage was still secure, a small blessing. He gently touched the blanket, adjusting it over the yearling's flank, then heard the adult blow softly, almost as though acknowledging his help. Standing there with snow stinging his cheeks, he felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. For so long, he had run away from any kind of responsibility or emotional tie, preferring to bury himself in the quiet demands of survival. Yet these Mustangs, lost in a swirling white desert, had awakened in him something he thought he'd buried with his uniform. Returning to the outpost, he found his dog Boone dozing by the stove, ears twitching as if chasing rabbits in his sleep. The stove's heat enveloped Caleb, and he took a moment to savor it. Removing his gloves, he placed them on the tabletop to dry. He poured the remnants of his coffee into the sink, not wanting any more caffeine. His heart was racing enough as it was. He pulled out a worn copy of some old Western novel, flipping through pages he'd read a dozen times. His eyes scanned the lines, but his mind refused to focus. Every creak of the wind outside, every swirl of snow that battered the windows, made him think about the Mustangs. Occasionally, he glanced toward the door, half expecting them to appear on the threshold, though he knew that was silly. They had their own place now, minimal as it was. Time passed. Eventually, he realized the night was slipping away. The storm outside howled, but he felt an inexplicable sense of calm. He rose from his makeshift seat, checking the locks out of habit, then paused. Did he really need to lock everything tonight? A small voice inside told him he didn't. Instead, he simply drew the bolt on the main door lightly, not fully latching it. Maybe it was a gesture of trust, or maybe he was simply exhausted. As he put out the lantern, he heard a short, muffled whinny from outside. It was low-pitched and oddly melodic, almost a greeting. He paused, hand on the lantern knob, the red glow fading from the wick. "They might be talking to me," he whispered under his breath, feeling a half-smile tug at his lips. In the darkness, he made his way to the narrow cot that served as his bed. Boone raised his head briefly, tail thumping once, then curled back into slumber. Caleb lay down, still wearing most of his winter clothes, and closed his eyes. For the first time since he moved to this lonely outpost, he found himself whispering a good night, not to himself, and not to the dog, but to the two strangers outside who had chosen to trust him with their safety, however tenuous that trust might be. His last thought before drifting to sleep was a gentle wish. Sleep well out there, wild warrior, as if the Mustangs could feel his words through the swirling snow. as if in that moment their hearts were connected by a fragile thread of empathy. And so the first night passed, with man and horse huddled against the relentless winter, forging a quiet bond that neither side fully understood, yet both seemed willing to embrace. Morning broke over the rugged landscape of Wyoming, bringing a brittle hush in the wake of the storm. The wind had tapered to a mere whisper overnight, leaving fresh snowdrifts against the lean-to and the old fence. A dull, pale light filtered through low-hanging clouds as Caleb stepped outside the outpost. He instinctively exhaled clouds of vapor, bracing himself for the cold. Boone, his aging shepherd mix, followed half a step behind, ears alert for any signs of movement. The first thing Caleb did was check on the Mustangs. Their shelter looked mostly intact, though a thin layer of new snow had blown in. The adult horse stood beside the younger one, which lay with its injured leg tucked inward. Both turned their heads to Caleb, ears flicking at his approach, but neither bolted nor showed alarm. He felt a faint relief seeing them alive and stable, at least for the moment. But as he walked around the pen, he noticed something out of place. Footprints pressed into the snow, near the side of the fence. Human footprints, definitely not left by him. The tracks circled around the pen and vanished toward a stand of stunted conifers at the edge of the outpost clearing. Boone padded over to sniff the impressions. A tail up and tense, Caleb's heart jolted. The presence of a stranger out here could mean anything. Maybe a poacher, or a traveler lost in the storm, or someone with darker intentions. Kneeling down, he examined the footprints, deeper at the heel, possibly from heavy boots. They weren't fresh from mere minutes ago, but not more than a few hours old. Either. He clicked his tongue softly to Boone and headed inside to grab his hunting rifle and binoculars. If someone had been snooping, he wanted to be prepared. Returning outdoors with the rifle slung over his shoulder, he followed the faint trail across the clearing. The morning light revealed more broken branches and scuffs on the snow, as though something or someone had brushed against the undergrowth. Boone sniffed the air, tail wagging but stiff, reflecting Caleb's own unease. "Keep alert," Caleb muttered, his breath plumed in the cold. The dog paused at the edge of a shallow ravine, letting out a low, uncertain growl. The wind carried intermittent crackles, maybe a branch snapping under leftover ice, or the subtle crunch of an unseen foot. Caleb raised his binoculars, scanning the line of trees that circled the outpost. Nothing moved, yet he couldn't shake the sense that someone was there. He considered calling out, but decided stealth might serve him better. Motioning for Boone to stay close, he slipped from tree to tree, keeping his rifle unholstered but pointed down. The footprints led farther than he expected, weaving behind a large pine half buried in blown snow. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a shape hunched behind the trunk. He lifted the rifle, heart pounding. "All right," Caleb called in a firm, measured voice. "Whoever you are, I can see you. Step out and show your hands." At once, there was a rustle of movement. A woman stood up, lifting both palms in the universal sign of no threat. She was wrapped head to toe in a thick parka, a fur-lined hood shadowing part of her face. A dusting of snow covered the shoulders of her jacket, and she held onto a backpack with a small antenna protruding, a radio GPS unit, by the look of it. "Take it easy," she said calmly. "I don't want any trouble." Caleb kept the rifle half lowered, but his muscles remained taut. "This is private property." "Mind telling me why you're prowling around my place? Are you the one who took in 2 Mustangs?" the woman asked, chest rising and falling with quick, frosty breaths. That caught him off guard. "Who wants to know?" She reached up, pulling back her hood a bit so he could see her face. Beneath the swirling snow, he saw a youngish woman, maybe early 30s, with sharp hazel eyes that never left his. "My name is Dr. Eliza Monroe. I'm with a Mustang preservation group that works in this region. Our field station's about 20 miles from here, near Cedar Pass. I've been tracking 2 lost horses." She nodded toward the old fence line in the distance. "I spotted them. One looks badly injured." Caleb's hold on the rifle loosened slightly. "You're with a conservation group?" She lifted the backpack's flap, revealing a small radio and laminated ID. "I've got the credentials if you want to see them." He hesitated, then beckoned with his chin. Step out from behind the tree. Slow. Let me see. She did as instructed, carefully handing over a plastic ID. Caleb glanced at it. Eliza Monroe,
DVM.
affiliated with a recognized equine preservation project. The photo matched her face. The tension in his shoulders eased fractionally, but a swirl of questions filled his head. How had she tracked them here? What did she plan to do with the Mustangs? Could she be trusted? All right, he said, returning the ID. Let's head back to the pen. I'll keep my rifle, and we'll talk. That fair? Eliza gave a brisk nod, pulling her hood back up against the wind. Fair enough. I only came because we lost contact with these Mustangs during the last storm. I'm not here to cause trouble. Boone, satisfied the woman posed no immediate threat, trotted behind them as they made their way back across the clearing. Once they reached the fence, Eliza paused, eyes narrowing at the sight of the two Mustangs, which were still huddled together. The adult lifted its head, ears pricked, sniffing in their direction. All right, that's them, Eliza said softly. Her gaze swept from the younger horse's bandaged leg to its trembling posture. We've been monitoring a small herd of 7 Mustangs migrating through these valleys. There's a radio tracker we usually attach to a loose, minimal harness, harmless to them. But after the last snowstorm, we lost the signal from 2 of them, an adult mare and a juvenile with a suspected leg injury. Caleb remembered hearing that some wildlife conservation teams used temporary trackers to keep up with herds in remote areas. You're saying they split off from the rest? Eliza sighed. Looks like it. We found a small blood trail and scuff marks near a cliff ledge. Must have been the younger one stumbling, or the mare trying to protect it. They vanished from the rest of the group. We've been combing the region for days, worried one or both might not make it. She glanced at Caleb, curiosity mingling with relief. Then I spotted your fence. I saw them from a distance this morning and circled around. She took a step forward, resting her arms on the fence rail. The adult Mustang pinned its ears, stepping protectively around the younger one. Easy, girl, Eliza murmured. I won't hurt you. Caleb studied her profile, uncertain whether he liked the idea of outsiders meddling in his domain. But the mention of a lost herd and real injuries softened his stance. You, plan on taking them? Only to a safe facility until their health stabilizes? She clarified. We typically rehab them at our station, then release them back into their family group if possible. They're wild animals. Nobody's trying to break or domesticate them. But this young one might not survive out here in the snow, especially with that leg. The mother, or older mare, is probably near her limit too. Caleb exhaled slowly, turning to watch the Mustangs. The younger one looked up with doleful eyes, shifting its weight gingerly. He felt a pang. They'd come this far, through storms and injury, only to end up half-sheltered in his battered old pen. If Eliza could help them rejoin their herd, that would be more than he'd ever hoped for. He laid his rifle against the fence. You said you're from a station about 20 miles out. How do you plan on getting them there? She folded her arms against the cold. My team set up a small staging area about 5 miles from here, near a frozen creek in the canyon. We were going to transport them by truck from that spot. But the roads are blocked with fallen trees, so I was trying to figure out if there's a route for snowmobiles or something similar. But from what I see, we'll definitely need local help. Her gaze flicked to him, and he felt an unspoken question. He took a moment, glancing at the Mustangs again. The older mare stared back with a calm but weary intensity, as though to say, all we need is a chance. All right, Caleb said at length. Let's talk inside. I might have something that can work. We can figure out the details. Inside the outpost, the chill receded somewhat, though the old stove struggled to warm the entire space. Eliza removed her thick gloves, flexing her fingers near the heat. Caleb offered her a seat at his small table and set a mug of hot coffee in front of her. Boone sat by the stove, watching the newcomer closely. For a few moments, neither spoke. The hush was broken only by the hiss of logs and an occasional whistle of wind against the window. Finally, Caleb cleared his throat. So, Dr. Monroe, you see I've been taking care of them. I've done what I can. but I'm no expert. She cupped her hands around the mug. Call me Eliza, please, and I appreciate what you've done. Most folks around here might have driven them off or, worse, shot them if they thought they were a liability. Caleb gave a half shrug. Didn't have the heart for that. The young one was about to collapse. I've tried to bandage the leg, but I don't know if it's sprained or broken. Eliza nodded. We can do a quick evaluation once we get them to the staging area. Or even here, if necessary. But they'll need a safe environment, better shelter, and possibly a veterinarian if that leg is more serious. He studied her face. Despite the cold, there was a warmth in her eyes that suggested genuine concern for the Mustangs. So what exactly is your plan? Taking a sip of coffee, Eliza explained. We have a small team. My colleague, Ranger Luke Carson, and 2 volunteers. They're camped at a halfway point, near a creek that's frozen solid. The idea was to bring in a specialized horse trailer or a rescue rig. But the road is impassable. We do, however, have snowmobiles and a basic sled we can outfit with blankets to carry an injured horse short distances. At least, that's the theory. But we need more local intel on the best path and how to handle the terrain. Caleb folded his arms across his chest. I do have a battered old snowmobile, call it Charlie. She's not the fastest, but she runs. I was in the service a long time, so I don't mind rough conditions. The canyon to the west has some decently packed trails if you know where to look. Might be a shot. Eliza's expression brightened. That's exactly what we need. Then her face grew serious again. But it's not just about the route. These Mustangs aren't used to being handled, even though they've let you care for them. They might panic in transit. Especially with the younger one's injury, we'll need to move slowly and keep them calm. Caleb nodded, recalling how the adult mare had eyed him warily for days. She's protective. I can't blame her. Eliza set down her mug, the tension in her shoulders evident. So, will you help us? Honestly, without you, I might not even be able to coax them out of that pen. A silence followed, broken only by the crack of a log in the stove. Caleb's mind flashed through potential risks, the difficulty of traveling in a blizzard, the chance of re-injuring the yearling, his own reluctance to let strangers onto his land. Yet the memory of that trembling young Mustang overcame any lingering doubt. Fine, he said quietly. I'll help. Relief spread across Eliza's face. Thank you. We don't want to remove them permanently. Just rehabilitate and release them to rejoin their family. The rest of the herd's out there, somewhere. Caleb gave her a curt nod. All right. Let's get moving before the weather takes another turn. They spent the next half hour laying out a plan. Caleb drew a rough map of the local terrain on an old piece of butcher paper. He indicated a passable route through the canyon that should connect to the frozen creek where Eliza's team waited. Along the way, they'd have to navigate partially collapsed trails, thick stands of pine, and potential avalanche zones. Outside, the sun was already slipping lower, leaving a weak glow behind the snow-choked clouds. A single glance told Caleb they needed to hurry. The forecast called for more snowfall that night, and the last thing they wanted was to be caught mid-transit in a fresh storm. Eliza excused herself to examine the Mustangs up close. With caution, she stepped into the pen, offering a handful of hay to the older mare. The horse tensed, but recognized the hay and eventually accepted it. Meanwhile, Caleb rechecked the younger one's bandage, verifying that it still held up despite the yearling's intermittent movement. Eliza crouched, peering at the leg. Could be a minor fracture or a strained tendon, she murmured. It's swollen, but not hopeless. After a brief discussion, they decided to wrap the younger Mustang in additional layers for warmth, rig a portable harness-like band around its torso, and walk it gently out of the pen. The adult mare, if all went well, would follow without too much distress, especially if Caleb was there to reassure them. Back at the outpost, Caleb yanked open an old shed where he kept Charlie, the snowmobile. It was worn and chipped in places, but it had enough horsepower to pull a small sled or two. While he checked the engine and fuel supply, Eliza prepared extra blankets, strapping them onto a wooden sled with bungee cords. They laid down a bed of hay to cushion the Mustangs if they needed to rest. Boone followed every movement, tail wagging, though he seemed uncertain about the flurry of new activity. Caleb patted the dog's flank. "Might be best if you stay behind." "Buddy, this is going to be rough." The dog whined but stayed near the cabin, as if sensing he'd only be in the way. It wasn't until the sun dipped beneath the ridgeline that they finalized everything. The sky darkened quickly, streaked with purple and gray. Eliza frowned at the looming clouds. "We'd better leave soon or we won't even make it halfway before the next storm." Caleb grunted in agreement. He stood at the fence, coaxing the Mustangs with soft murmurs as Eliza opened the gate. The adult mare hesitated, ears twitching at the roar of the snowmobile's engine, but with gentle nudges and calm voices, they managed to lead her out. The younger Mustang limped along, bandaged leg trembling. Caleb moved slowly, giving it time to find a rhythm. Once they'd cleared the immediate area, Eliza carefully guided the young horse onto a plywood sled lined with bedding. The adult mare sniffed the arrangement, blowing nervous breaths, but seeing as there was no immediate harm, she allowed the process, eventually stepping partially onto the sled as well. "Steady," Caleb said, positioning himself at the snowmobile's controls. "We'll go slow." He pulled a throttle gently, and Charlie lurched forward, the harness line pulling the makeshift sled. Snow crunched under the runners, and the Mustangs shifted uncomfortably at the new sensation. Eliza walked alongside as best she could, bracing the sled and speaking in a soothing tone. They set off into the descending twilight. Leaving the outpost behind, Caleb didn't look back. He was too focused on the path ahead, on guiding the snowmobile around buried rocks and hidden dips. The engine droned, echoing between canyon walls that glistened with frozen waterfalls. Each mile felt precarious. The younger Mustang occasionally whinnied in pain or fear, but Eliza was quick to reassure it. Through it all, the adult mare stayed near, trotting alongside when the terrain allowed, or stepping onto the sled to share warmth. Every so often, it would toss its head as though to challenge the unfamiliar contraption, but it never broke away. Caleb marveled at the bond between them. He wondered what sort of bridle path they had traveled before fate led them to his broken fence. As night settled fully, the temperature dropped fast. A biting wind funneled through the gorge, scraping across the cliffs. Caleb steered Charlie along a narrow track, guided mainly by the faint glow of the headlamp and his memory of the route. Snow had begun to drift into any dip or hollow, creating deceptively soft but potentially dangerous traps. Eliza walked behind the sled, glancing back every few yards to check on the Mustangs. Her breath came out in ragged puffs, eyes watering from the cold. "They're holding up," she called over the engine's drone, though her tone revealed concern. The younger Mustang especially looked ready to collapse at times, its face pinched with pain. Yet it soldiered on, perhaps sensing rescue lay ahead. The canyon stretched before them, a ghostly corridor of wind-sculpted drifts and jagged outcrops. Occasionally, the adult mare decided to leap onto the back portion of the sled, jostling the younger one. Eliza would steady them, murmuring encouragement. The Mustangs' coats glistened with frost, their eyes reflecting the faint sheen of the snowmobile's headlamp. Caleb found the silence unnerving. Despite the engine's noise, the vast emptiness of the canyon weighed on them. No animals stirred in the night, no calls of distant coyotes, just the relentless moan of wind and the squeak of their sled dragging across ice. He forced himself to remain calm, hyper-aware that if they encountered a sudden drop-off, the entire convoy could end in disaster. Time blurred. They traveled perhaps a mile or two, though it felt like 10. One misstep nearly sent them off a low embankment when the snowmobile's skis caught a hidden stump. But Caleb wrestled the vehicle back on course. Eliza stumbled, scraping her knee, but waved off any concern. The Mustangs whinnied in alarm, stamping hooves on the sled. Eventually, they moved on. They paused for a quick breather near a rock overhang. There, the canyon widened, allowing the wind to swirl in chaotic gusts. Overhead, the sky rumbled with an ominous sound, like distant thunder, but it was only the gale colliding with ridges of high snow. Eliza removed her hood briefly, wiping sweat from her brow. "We need to hurry. The forecast said the snow would hit tomorrow, but it's looking worse by the minute." Caleb scanned the sky, Low-hanging clouds churned and thickened, swallowing what little moonlight remained. If we push too fast, we risk injuring the colt's leg further, but staying here is not an option either. Eliza nodded in agreement, checking the younger horse's bandage. It was still in place, though dark with melted snow. We're so close. Maybe another 2 miles and we'll be at the base of the creek. My colleagues are waiting there. She squeezed the Mustang's muzzle in reassurance. Hang on, little one. Faintly, the wind carried the first flurries of a new snowfall. Caleb felt a cold dread settle in his gut. If a true blizzard struck now, they'd be forced to set up a camp in an even more exposed location. He thought of the half-frozen yearling and bit down on his anxiety. Let's move, he said. Another half-mile on. The storm came in a rush. The wind roared, lashing them with white gusts that stung their faces. The snowmobile's headlamp revealed only swirling flakes, making it impossible to see beyond a few yards. Even the adult mare, which had been cooperating so far, started to spook, head tossing in agitation. The younger horse let out a mournful cry, as though sensing the swirling chaos was beyond its endurance. We won't make it to your team in this, Caleb shouted over the gale. Eliza clenched her jaw, scanning for any windbreak. We should find some sort of natural cover and set up a shelter. Otherwise, we risk losing them or ourselves in this whiteout. Scraping the canyon's edges, they found a slight rise of rock forming a shallow alcove. It wasn't a cave, but it was better than nothing. Caleb maneuvered Charlie carefully, parking it behind a bulge of stone that blocked the worst of the wind. Eliza tugged at the sled's ropes, coaxing the Mustangs forward. The adult resisted at first, ears pinned, but the punishing wind soon convinced it to follow. They worked quickly. Caleb's experience in harsh conditions guided him as he pulled out collapsible tent poles, a couple of tarps, and a handful of metal stakes. Eliza helped him hammer them into any cracks in the rock, while snow pelted their backs. Each gust threatened to rip the tarp from their hands, forcing them to lean their full weight on it. At last, they erected a small, makeshift canopy. It was no palace, barely a stable lean-to for the horses, plus a cramped space for 2 humans and a tiny fire pit. Caleb used the snowmobile's emergency kit to start a modest flame. Eliza rummaged in her backpack for a thermos of warm water. She carefully offered it to the yearling, which lapped at the water greedily. Inside this improvised haven, they managed to drape the Mustangs with an extra blanket each. The swirling wind still cut in from the sides, but at least there was some barrier to the worst of the blizzard. Shivering, Eliza and Caleb huddled near the flickering fire, which glowed against the snow-laden rock. Both took turns drying their gloves and checking the ropes that secured the canopy. The adult mare paced in a tight circle, occasionally nickering in distress. The younger horse lay down, tucking its injured leg under its body. Eliza knelt beside it, feeling the bandage. It's still holding, but if this storm keeps up, we'll be stuck here overnight. Caleb nodded gravely. His lips felt numb, and he had to concentrate to form words. We'll do watches, just in case the tarp comes loose or more snow piles on, she agreed, rummaging for an energy bar from her pack. She handed half to Caleb, who devoured it in a few bites. This is the last place I expected to be, she said quietly, glancing at the Mustangs. But they're safer here than out in the open. A shrieking gust rattled the tarp overhead, showering them with loose snow. The adult mare snorted, half rearing, and Eliza rushed to calm it, stroking its neck gently. Caleb stared into the embers of the small fire, thinking about how surreal it was to find himself sheltering wild horses in a mountain blizzard with a stranger he'd just met. Yet, somehow, it felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The storm raged for hours. Snow hissed against the makeshift shelter, threatening to bury them. Caleb and Eliza alternated watch shifts, periodically knocking accumulated snow off the tarp to keep it from collapsing. Between these tasks, they dozed in fitful naps, lulled by the hiss of the wind. The adult mare paced or stood guard over the younger one, occasionally inching closer to the human's fire for warmth, somewhere in the darkest hours of night. Caleb awoke from a short sleep to see Eliza dozing upright, face pale with fatigue. The Mustangs were huddled just a few feet away, breath visible in the gloom. He stifled a groan as he stood, stretching stiff limbs. Padding over to the edge of the shelter, he poked his head into the storm. It was still dark, but the swirling wind seemed to have eased slightly. Maybe a hint that morning wasn't too far off. Glancing back, he realized the adult mare had stepped within arm's reach of the fire. It watched him with ears forward, not pinned, just cautious. Caleb felt a faint stirring of awe. Each day with these creatures seemed to peel away layers of distrust, forging a bond neither truly understood. He inched closer, extending a hand, and the mare sniffed his glove. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and he thought he recognized an emotion there, acceptance, or perhaps gratitude. "You know I'm not here to hurt you, right?" he murmured. The mare blinked, lowering her head, and the younger horse shifted to rest more comfortably. A moment later, Eliza stirred, blinking away sleep. "Storm's still going." "Huh? Slowing a bit," he replied softly. "We might stand a chance of moving on come dawn." She rubbed her eyes and looked at the horses. "They haven't run off, so that's a good sign." Then a faint smile crossed her lips. "You're good with them. They trust you." Caleb considered it. They had no choice. Really, not in their condition. But yeah, maybe we're learning to trust each other. He inhaled deeply, feeling the sting of cold air in his lungs. "Let's just hope we all make it to your team in time." Throughout the rest of the night, the tarp flapped and threatened to rip. The wind howled, and spindrifts occasionally cascaded into their shelter. Yet inside that cramped space, an unspoken understanding grew, an alliance forged by necessity and sealed by compassion. For the Mustangs, for each other, and for the quiet promise of survival, the world still wore its frigid white cloak when dawn crept over the camp. Though the worst of the blizzard had passed, the air remained razor-sharp with cold, and new drifts of snow had formed like small dunes around the tents and the improvised corral. Caleb rose earlier than Eliza, rubbing sleep from his eyes, determined to make the most of the morning calm. After checking on the two Mustangs, both huddled near a low windbreak of pine boughs, he decided to venture out for more firewood. He strapped on a simple backpack made from rough canvas and slung a small hatchet at his hip. Inside his coat pocket, he tucked a handheld radio, set to the frequency Eliza had shown him. The plan was straightforward. Follow the partially frozen creek bed for a short distance to find any trees snapped by the storm's fury. He'd gather enough wood to last them another night, if needed. The new-fallen snow glimmered in the early light, unmarked except for his footprints and those of small, nocturnal creatures. As he moved away from camp, the wind carried a hush through the scraggly pine. Each step sank him ankle-deep into powder, and occasionally, he had to kick free of half-buried branches. The creek cut an icy path alongside him, its surface mostly frozen but still gurgling faintly beneath the crust. Caleb scanned for potential dangers, more storms, hidden ravines, or predatory wildlife, but all seemed quiet. He soon found a cluster of fallen limbs, the wood brittle and splintered where the wind had torn it from the trunk. Perfect for fuel, he set to work with the hatchet, cutting manageable lengths, stacking them in the backpack until it grew heavy. Despite the freezing temperature, the effort warmed him, beads of sweat forming under his hat. Another short walk led him to the base of a rocky slope. He paused, stepping gingerly around chunks of snow-sheathed bark. The landscape felt deserted, like a world paused in endless winter. Then something caught his eye. Impressions in the snow that did not belong to boots or small forest creatures. Hoofprints, a single set, half filled by drifting snow. Their shape was distinct, but the gait appeared uneven, almost staggering. Caleb crouched to examine them. The spacing suggested a horse in poor condition, maybe injured or exhausted. His pulse quickened. While he and Eliza were caring for two Mustangs, it had never occurred to him there might be another one wandering alone in this wilderness. The prince angled off toward the forested edge of the creek, weaving erratically. Frowning, he followed, curiosity mingling with apprehension. Could this be another member of the same herd, separated by the storm? Each step carried him farther from the camp. But something about the idea of a lone, suffering Mustang kept him moving forward. The morning sun glinted off the snow, casting tiny rainbows on the surface. Caleb pressed on, boots crunching softly in the hush. Soon, the tracks led him to a gentle rise overlooking a small clearing. From behind a cluster of pines, he peered out, and his heart lurched. A thin, bedraggled Mustang stood in the open, framed by a vast canvas of pristine white. Every rib was visible along its flank, the bony outlines of its hips pressing against its hide. The horse's mane was laced with ice, and it held one foreleg at an odd angle, as though the joint might be locked or frozen. In its stance, he read pure exhaustion. At first, the Mustang didn't see him. It stared vacantly toward the horizon, as if stunned by the unrelenting cold. Then the wind shifted, carrying Caleb's scent. The horse's ears flicked, and it jerked its head up, letting out a faint, raspy nicker that held no real threat, more a reflex of fear. It tried to step away, hooves slipping in the snow, but managed only a few shaky strides before stopping, sides heaving. Caleb's gut twisted at the sight. This was a creature on the brink. He recognized the signs: lowered head, hollowed-out gaze, a body that had burned nearly every resource. Slipping his hatchet into the loop on his belt, he held his hands wide, showing he had no weapon drawn. "It's all right," he breathed, voice low. "Steady. Easy there." Slowly, he sank to one knee in the snow, reducing his height to appear less intimidating. The Mustang's ears pinned back, tail swishing in agitation, but it didn't flee. Perhaps it couldn't. Caleb edged closer, speaking in a gentle murmur. "You're alone, aren't you?" He parted his coat to reveal he carried no rope or bridle in hand. "I see you. I'm not here to hurt you." He knew the horse wouldn't understand the words, but sometimes the tone mattered more. Step by careful step, he closed the distance until he was maybe 20 feet away. The Mustang rolled an eye at him, half-lidded with exhaustion. Its breath came in visible bursts of vapor. He paused, letting them share that silent tension. He was close enough now to see how the foreleg trembled, half bent. It could be a sprain, a break, or even the onset of frostbite. If the horse was this far gone, it likely wouldn't last another night alone. Behind him, the wind sighed through the pines. He could almost hear Eliza's voice in his head telling him to call for backup. Reaching into his coat, he retrieved the radio. "Eliza, you copy?" he said quietly. A burst of static. Then Eliza's voice. "Eliza here. Everything okay? I'm about 300 meters east of the camp." Caleb replied. "Found another Mustang. Looks in terrible shape." He heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Another one?" "Yeah. Malnourished and possibly injured. I'm trying not to spook it. Can you send help? Maybe Ranger Luke with the second sled?" "Understood," Eliza said. "Sit tight." Luke's prepping gear now. Caleb clipped the radio to his collar. He turned back to the Mustang, which regarded him with weary suspicion. The wind whipped some loose snow across them, swirling in delicate flurries. Caleb rummaged in his backpack for a handful of dried grass he'd brought, mere scraps from the stash at camp. But it was something. He gently tossed a few stems onto the snow between them, hoping the scent might coax the horse forward. At first, it simply stood there, nostrils flaring, but after a tense moment, it lowered its muzzle, sniffing. It took one step. Timid, uncertain, then paused again. Caleb remained motionless, except for a slight, welcoming gesture with his free hand. The horse let out a shaky sigh. Inch by inch, it nosed the scattered grass, not devouring it but tasting, as if to confirm it was real. Time seemed suspended in that clearing. No bird calls, no footsteps beyond the occasional crunch of shifting hooves. All that existed was the ragged breathing of a Mustang at the edge of survival and a man who couldn't walk away. Caleb set a folded blanket on the snow behind him, an invitation, if the horse wanted to step closer. He dared not push further. Eventually, he heard the distant hum of another snowmobile. Looking up, he spotted Luke Carson, bundled in a heavy parka, approaching from the west. The Ranger cut the engine a good 50 yards away. presumably to avoid alarming the Mustang further. Luke dismounted and waved, then advanced on foot. Caleb placed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Luke nodded, setting down a small rescue sled padded with blankets. Together, they observed the horse, which flicked an ear at Luke's arrival but did not bolt. "It's about out of options, isn't it?" Luke whispered. Caleb swallowed hard. "I think so. We either help it now or watch it die." The horse half turned, tail swishing weakly, but it made no attempt to flee. Perhaps it sensed that flight was impossible, or perhaps it dimly recognized that these humans had come to assist. Caleb rose slowly, stepping aside so the horse could see Luke as well. The ranger was a tall man with a calm demeanor, used to handling stressed animals. "All right," Luke murmured. "Let's do it carefully." They laid a folded tarp on the snow a few paces in front of the Mustang, sprinkling some hay on top. The horse eyed them, then stepped uncertainly onto the tarp, nostrils flaring at the new scent. Luke waited until it was stable, then motioned for Caleb. They lifted one corner of the tarp behind the horse, creating a gentle funnel toward the small sled. Each movement was slow, punctuated by soft reassurances. The Mustang snorted, stepping forward again, stumbling but not fighting. The tension in the air was palpable. Caleb's heart hammered, worried that a sudden panic could cause it to lash out and break a leg or injure them, but the horse never lashed out. Instead, it sagged onto the tarp, as if surrendering to exhaustion. Caleb sucked in a shaky breath, exhaling with relief. "I think it's done running." Luke nodded, hooking the tarp edges to the sled's frame. "Let's get it back before the wind picks up again." Before they moved, Caleb stroked the horse's neck, feeling the coarse mane crusted with ice. "I don't think you want to be alone anymore, do you?" he whispered, voice raw with empathy. The Mustang's ears twitched, but made no other response. In that fleeting moment, hope glimmered in Caleb's mind. Maybe they were not too late after all. Transporting the third Mustang back to the makeshift camp was a delicate undertaking. Luke and Caleb worked in tandem, each holding an edge of the tarp attached to a short rescue sled. The horse lay prone for most of the journey, eyelids heavy but occasionally flicking open at every bump or shift. When they reached uneven ground, it tried to stand, only to collapse back onto the sled, too weak to maintain its balance. They paused more than once to calm the animal, speaking in hushed tones, offering bits of hay or letting it sniff the gloves they wore. The cold nipped at their exposed cheeks and seeped through their boots. But both men pressed on, determined not to jostle the horse any more than necessary. At times, the creature's hindquarters slid off the sled's edge, requiring them to halt and reposition. Yet even in those moments, it displayed no aggression, just a weary resignation. It took the better part of an hour to cover the short distance. When the faint silhouettes of the camp came into view, a surge of relief coursed through Caleb. From between the tent flaps, he saw Eliza step outside, shielding her eyes from the glare of fresh snow. She spotted them and hurried forward, waving one arm. "What do you have there?" she called, though the concern in her voice suggested she already knew. "The third Mustang," Caleb replied, breath steaming in ragged puffs, barely hanging on. Eliza jogged out to meet them, her boots crunching loudly over the crusted drifts. She'd cleared an area next to the existing corral, expanding a small enclosure with extra rope and tarps to block the wind. "Bring it here," she said, pointing to the corner where fresh straw and blankets lay in readiness. Together, they maneuvered the sled into the enclosure. The two Mustangs they already had under care sensed something significant was happening. The adult mare, standing behind a temporary barrier, flattened her ears and let out a long, echoing whinny, a sound that filled the entire camp with its urgency. The younger Mustang, still bandaged and resting on a bed of straw, lifted its head. Its eyes widened, ears straining forward. Luke grimaced, glancing at Caleb. That mare knows something. Eliza unlocked the makeshift gate, guiding them inside. The big mare began pacing, snorting hard, hooves striking the ground in agitation. Meanwhile, the newly arrived horse tried to shift off the sled, legs flailing once before settling again. The younger Mustang answered its mother's whinny with a trembling neigh, as though mustering every ounce of strength to call out. "Easy, easy," Eliza murmured, stepping around to check the new arrival's condition. She placed a gentle hand on its neck. "Let's see if it can stand." Caleb and Luke unhooked the tarp sides, carefully freeing the horse from the sled. The adult mare gave another piercing call, then trotted in a tight circle, eyes fixed on the newcomer. In response, the exhausted Mustang raised its head, ears perked. For a brief instant, life flickered in its gaze. A spark of recognition. "Perhaps," Eliza, holding a halter loosely, motioned to Caleb. "I'll keep watch on the mare. You and Luke see if you can coax it to move closer." They eased the horse onto its side, giving it room to roll upright if it wished. After a shuddering breath, it tried to clamber to its feet. The first attempt failed, hooves scraping the straw, chest heaving. On the second attempt, it managed to stand, though its rear legs wobbled precariously, its head craned around, searching for that voice, that call it had just heard. From the other side of the enclosure, the younger Mustang let out a weak nicker, struggling upright from its own resting spot. The adult mare, high-strung with anticipation, lifted her tail and gave a powerful snort, ear tips quivering. Then, as if driven by a force that transcended fear, she maneuvered around the barrier, pushing past Caleb and Luke, hooves scattering straw in her haste to reach the new horse. "They recognize each other," Luke breathed. The two horses locked eyes. The newly arrived Mustang took a lurching step forward, nearly collapsing again. But the mare pressed her muzzle gently against its cheek, steadying it. A charge of energy rippled through both animals. The younger Mustang, bandaged leg and all, limped over to press its forehead to the newcomer's shoulder. Eliza watched, transfixed. "It's like a silent conversation," she whispered. Caleb couldn't tear his gaze away. The air crackled with an unspoken bond that neither storm nor distance had broken. The third Mustang, though all but spent, let out a soft, fluttering whinny in response to the mare's welcome. The younger one squeaked a higher note, touching its nose to the newcomer's chest. The older mare circled them once, as if to confirm, "Yes, you are truly here." In that moment, the ragged campsite seemed to glow with a sense of profound reunion. Luke let out a long exhale he hadn't realized he was holding. "Never seen anything like it," he murmured. "They're talking." Eliza brushed back a tear that threatened to form in the corner of her eye. "They're family," she said simply. Caleb stood with arms folded, face drawn in awe. "This is what we were missing," he said under his breath, uncertain if he spoke of the horses or his own life. Once the initial flurry of emotion subsided, they guided the newly arrived Mustang toward a soft bed of straw, close enough for it to nestle against the other two but also separated by a low partition if it needed quiet. Exhaustion weighed heavily on it, legs trembling as it collapsed onto the bedding. The adult mare hovered protectively, sniffing at the newcomer's coat, while the younger horse nuzzled closer, occasionally letting out small, contented nickers. Eliza, pen in hand, recorded observations in a small notebook. If it's male, this could be a brother or possibly the father. Hard to say without a thorough examination. But based on the dynamic, I'm leaning toward an older sibling scenario. She glanced at Caleb. Either way, this is a major piece of the puzzle, a missing member of their group. He nodded, noticing how the two Mustangs that had already grown accustomed to the camp seemed calmer now that the new horse was with them. "You think we'll need more sedation?" he asked softly, recalling the sedatives Eliza kept on hand for extreme stress. "Not right now," Eliza said. "He's too weak for sedation anyway. The best thing is to let them be close. That's more healing than anything I could offer." Luke rubbed the back of his neck, scanning the newly expanded enclosure. "We'll have to keep them warm. Another storm could set us back if we aren't careful." Caleb tapped the side of his boot, mind-churning. "We have enough tarps and ropes to shield more of the pen's perimeter. If we set up an extra windbreak, they can share body heat." Eliza beamed. "Yes, let's do that." They spent the next hour reinforcing the enclosure. By the time they finished, All three Mustangs were nestled against each other. The older mare lay with her legs folded. The yearling pressed to her flank, and the newcomer curled close enough that their coats touched. Occasionally, one of them would raise its head and glance around, but mostly they rested, safe in the presence of family. Caleb found himself lingering near the gate, reluctant to walk away. A subtle hush had fallen over the camp. No frantic neighs, no stamping hooves, just the soft shuffle of straw and the sigh of wind overhead. He saw the exhaustion and relief in the Mustang's eyes, and he felt it mirrored in his own spirit. He turned to Luke and Eliza, who stood quietly off to the side, sharing a moment of silent triumph. "You did good," Luke said, nodding to Caleb. "If not for you, that third one wouldn't have had a chance." Caleb shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "Just did what anyone would." Eliza gave him a small, knowing smile. "Not everyone. Plenty of people would have given up or decided it wasn't worth the risk." A mixture of modesty and humility colored Caleb's expression. He rubbed at the back of his neck, searching for the right words. "I guess I can't stand seeing something helpless with no one to stand for it." They left it at that. The day was pressing on, and though the immediate crisis was over, there would be more work to do. For now, though, the camp settled into a gentle lull. Three Mustangs, once torn apart by weather and fate, shared a moment of peace, brought together by pure human empathy and the fragile resilience of life. In the hours that followed the third Mustang's arrival, the atmosphere at the camp transformed. Before, an undercurrent of tension had pervaded every moment. Would the two injured horses survive the cold? Would the next storm force them to move again? Now, there was a palpable lightness in the air, as if the mere presence of the reunited trio sparked hope. They made a cozy ring in the straw near the fire, the adult mare lying on the outer edge, the younger in the middle, and the newly arrived stallion, or older colt, curled protectively on the other side. Occasionally, the stallion still trembled or let out a pained whinny, but whenever he did, the mare sniffed his muzzle, and the younger one pressed closer, as though comforting him. It was a scene of unwavering solidarity. Eliza knelt nearby, observing with professional fascination and personal admiration. She scribbled notes in the dim light, describing the color patterns, the scars, and the distinctive white patch on the colt's chest. "This must be the trio we tracked," she said in a hushed tone, addressing Luke and Caleb. "We suspected they were a close-knit subfamily in the larger herd. The mare is definitely older, maybe 5 or 6. The young one's about a year old, and this colt might be 3. You see how he defers to the mare, letting her stand guard?" Caleb nodded, arms resting on his knees, a cold mug of coffee forgotten at his side. "They look different now, like they're calm, even happy." Luke, standing with his arms crossed, gave a rare grin. "It's amazing what a difference family makes." Outside the enclosure, the wind still gusted from time to time, reminding them that winter's fury hadn't vanished. But now, the Mustang's soft knickers, slow breathing, and gentle shifting of hooves replaced the tension of the previous days. They had a reason to rest, to heal. They were together. As the afternoon wore on, Eliza confirmed the genetic link with a closer inspection. She gently lifted the colt's foreleg, checking for possible sprains or fractures, all the while murmuring softly to keep him calm. The mare watched every move, ears pricked, but showed no aggression, only a vigilant acceptance. "Dorsal stripes, matching ear notches," Eliza murmured. "Yes, it's definitely the same line. Part of the 7 we've been monitoring since late autumn. They must have gotten separated near the canyon pass. If we hadn't intervened, each one could have died alone." She paused, glancing at Caleb. "You're giving them a real chance to live." He shrugged, though an undeniable warmth spread through his chest. "They gave me something, too." No one asked him to elaborate, but Luke cast him a sideways look that said he understood. They all had their reasons for being out here, in this remote expanse of snow and sky, seeking or escaping something. The Mustangs, too, had traveled a long road, forging and losing connections along the way. Later, Caleb found himself alone near the dwindling fire pit, sipping a fresh cup of coffee. The camp was quiet. Eliza had gone to radio her team with updates, and Luke was reinforcing the windbreak around their shelter. The 3 Mustangs dozed in a cluster, the mare occasionally twitching her ears if a gust of wind ruffled her mane. Caleb gazed at the flickering embers, letting his mind wander back to old memories, nights spent on deployment, scanning the horizon for threats. The faces of fellow soldiers who didn't make it home, the worn letters from family he once left unanswered, even the ranch he grew up on. The father he'd disappointed by enlisting instead of taking over the family business, the sense of belonging that had slipped through his fingers. He inhaled a shaky breath. The swirling thoughts eventually landed on the sight before him. 3 battered Mustangs, lovingly curled around each other as though their mere closeness would mend every wound, physical and emotional. In them, he saw reflections of his own battles and separations. If they could overcome the severance of the storm and find each other again, maybe he could piece together parts of himself he'd long thought lost. His eyes stung with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. A kind of gratitude. Maybe, he swallowed, staring into the steam rising from his coffee. They found home in each other. He murmured to no one in particular. And me? I'm still out there, somewhere on that trail. A small sound behind him drew his attention. Eliza stood by the fire, a gentleness in her gaze. She must have overheard. Everything okay? She asked softly. He offered a half smile. As okay as it can be, I guess. Just thinking. Then he cleared his throat, gesturing at the Mustangs. They look peaceful. Eliza followed his gaze. Yes, they do. The difference is night and day. It's like they've come back to life. They sat quietly, watching the Mustangs in the gloaming. Outside, snow continued to fall in lazy flurries, dusting the camp with silver. The wind's earlier bite had softened, as though acknowledging that the darkest part of the journey was now past. After a time, Eliza gently placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. You've done something few people would attempt. You went out alone to save that 3rd horse, and you've been caring for these 2 since they arrived. Don't dismiss it. This is a big deal. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck, a familiar gesture of modesty. I'm not sure who's saving who, to be honest. Eliza's lips curved in a warm smile. Maybe it goes both ways. From across the enclosure, the mare lifted her head, eyes reflecting the subdued glow of the camp lanterns. Her ears pointed toward them, as if sensing the gentle tone of their conversation. The younger horse stirred, nestling closer to its newly returned sibling. The stallion let out a slow, contented breath, as though breathing for the first time without the weight of the storm on its shoulders. Look at that, Eliza said softly. They're forming their circle again. The 3 Mustangs had shifted, pressing flank to flank in a ring, a symbolic gesture of survival. They might still bear the scars of their ordeal, but in that circle was a quiet assurance that they were whole once more. Night came gently, draping the camp in a serene hush. Snow crystals sparkled where the lantern light touched, creating a tapestry of white and gold. Caleb rose and walked to the edge of the corral, resting an arm on the makeshift gate. He stared at the trio, letting a contentment he hadn't felt in years settle over him. Eliza appeared beside him. They'll rest well tonight, she said. And soon, we'll figure out how to get them safely to our main facility. Once they're healed, we'll aim to reunite them with the rest of the herd. He nodded, heart swelling with an unspoken emotion. You're sure we can find their family group? She answered with unwavering confidence. Yes, Mustangs have strong ties. If the rest of the herd is still in the region, they'll recognize each other's calls and scents. And even if we can't bring them together right away, at least we'll give them a chance to roam free again one day. A fragile smile played at Caleb's lips. He recalled the lines he'd spoken so often in the past few days. Who's really rescuing who? Behind them, the dying embers of the fire hissed softly under a fine layer of drifting snow. The final image of the night was that of 3 Mustangs, once lost and separated, lying close enough for their breath to intermingle, their hearts beating in quiet unity. For this night, at least, they had all found a sanctuary, man and horse alike, warmed by the same spark of hope in a winter wilderness. Early that morning, Eliza stepped out of her small, makeshift tent, radio in hand. The night's cold still clung to the air, but there was an undercurrent of hope. She held the device to her ear, listening intently. When the transmission ended, she turned to Caleb, who stood near the 3 Mustangs, checking the bandage on the younger horse's leg. "That was my team," she said, voice laced with excitement. "They've managed to clear one of the secondary roads leading to our Mustang Recovery Center. It's not perfect, still icy and blocked in places, but a truck with an insulated horse compartment can reach a rendezvous at the frozen creek." Caleb looked up, eyebrows lifting. "So we can move them today?" She nodded. "If we don't run into more storms..." "Yes, a specialized pickup with a heated transport box is already on its way. We just need to guide the Mustangs a short distance to the creek. I'd like to leave as soon as possible." With that, she switched off the radio and slipped it into her pocket. Caleb patted the young horse's neck, feeling a surge of relief. "Then let's get them ready," he said quietly. The camp buzzed with subdued energy. Eliza gently rechecked the younger Mustang's leg. Over the days, its swelling had diminished, but the joint was still tender. She replaced the existing bandages with fresh ones, adding a layer of soft cotton padding and clean gauze. "I want to give it maximum support," she explained, "so the journey won't aggravate the injury." Caleb, meanwhile, fashioned a makeshift corridor out of packed snow and a few spare rails to create a safer path. He knew that if the Mustangs became skittish during loading, any sharp turn or hidden rock could harm them further. The adult mare followed his movements with curious eyes, while the newly arrived stallion paced near the back of the enclosure. "There," Caleb said, stepping back to admire his work. "That should guide them toward the loading ramp with minimal risk." Eliza watched the 3 Mustangs. They seemed alert, as though sensing something significant was about to happen. The mare circled the younger 2, occasionally lifting her head to test the air. A faint whinny escaped her, more thoughtful than afraid. The stallion rubbed its muzzle against the younger horse's shoulder, tail flicking in a gentle rhythm. To Caleb, the scene looked like a family preparing for a journey they couldn't fully understand, but somehow accepted. "Let's hope they trust us," he murmured. Eliza gave him a reassuring nod. "They trust you, Caleb. That goes a long way." By mid-morning, the rumble of an approaching engine echoed off the nearby cliffs. Caleb and Eliza stood at the edge of the camp as a specialized pickup truck came into view. A sturdy vehicle with an enclosed compartment designed for cold-weather livestock transport. 2 volunteers jumped down, scanning the surroundings with keen eyes. They wasted no time. One volunteer unfolded a short ramp, coated with a grippy rubber surface. Inside the insulated compartment, thick blankets, radiant heaters, and buckets of warm water waited. There was even a stash of high-energy feed. Eliza and Caleb carefully led the Mustangs out of the enclosure. The adult mare tossed her head once but made no move to run. The stallion followed with a slight limp, while the younger horse relied on Eliza's soothing voice to keep calm. Step by cautious step, the mare ascended the ramp. She paused briefly, nostrils flaring, then continued forward without protest. The stallion and the young horse soon joined her, guided by gentle urging. Once all 3 were inside, the volunteers closed the door. Through a small gap, Caleb caught the young horse's gaze. It lingered on him, ears forward, until the door sealed with a quiet thud. His chest tightened, a mixture of relief and an inexplicable pang of loss. It was done. The Mustangs were en route to a safer place. The truck's engine idled, a steady hum rising into the crisp air. Caleb approached the side of the vehicle, where a small opening allowed him to slip his hand inside. He felt the warm, muscled neck of the adult mare, her coat still damp from the snow. She lifted her head to meet his touch. No fear, just a profound calmness. Her dark eyes, deep and reflective, seemed to say thank you in a language neither human nor horse could fully speak. He stroked her mane, a gentle motion meant to reassure them both. Suddenly, the younger horse poked its muzzle through the gap, huffing a warm breath against his gloved fingers. Caleb smiled, heat prickling behind his eyes. "Easy there," he whispered, voice catching. "You'll be all right." The stallion stood just behind the mare, quietly observing. It didn't move forward, but Caleb felt its presence. All three Mustangs radiated a surprising serenity, as though they sensed they were heading someplace where healing was possible. Their time with him had been brief, yet in that span, he had grown attached in ways he'd never expected. Overcome by the moment, he simply closed his eyes, letting himself feel the gentle exhalations against his hand. "I'll never forget this," he thought, memorizing every detail, the smell of horse sweat and straw, the crunch of snow underfoot, the swirl of emotion in his chest. Eliza stepped up beside him, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. "They'll be well cared for," she said softly. "We'll send you updates on their recovery, progress reports, even photos, and when they're ready for release." She paused, measuring his reaction. "I'd like you to be there." "If you want," Caleb exhaled, forcing a smile. "I'd appreciate that. More than you know." His gaze flicked to the rear of the transport, where the volunteers were double-checking the locks. Eliza squeezed his shoulder gently. "It feels like they've become a part of both of us." He nodded, swallowing hard. "They have. It's strange how you can feel so responsible for them, like they're a missing piece you didn't realize you'd lost." A solemn understanding passed between them. Sometimes, a simple gesture of help grows into a bond that redefines you. Eliza stepped away to speak with the driver, confirming the route and discussing any final details. Caleb stood by, heart heavy yet hopeful, as the truck rumbled in preparation for departure. With a curt nod from the driver, the vehicle began to move. Snow crunched under the tires as it rolled off the makeshift path. Caleb and Eliza followed, boots sinking in soft drifts, until they reached a gentle rise that overlooked the frozen creek. There, they stopped, watching as the truck's taillights grew smaller under the pale winter sun. Neither spoke. The wind gusted gently, stirring the leftover footprints and the scattered hay near what had been the Mustang's temporary pen. Eventually, the truck vanished around a bend, the quiet canyon reclaiming its stillness. Caleb's breath escaped in a trembling sigh. "They're gone," he said, more to himself than to Eliza. She nodded, crossing her arms to ward off the chill. "Just for now. This isn't a permanent goodbye." He stared at the faint tracks in the snow. "No," he whispered. "It's just goodbye for a while." In his mind, he imagined the young horse peering back, ears pricked, as if to ask for reassurance. All he could do was stand in the cold and trust that they were on the path they were meant to follow. After helping Eliza secure the remaining equipment and dismantle the makeshift shelters, Caleb packed his belongings onto his old snowmobile. "Charlie." They parted ways near the canyon mouth. Eliza would travel to rejoin her team, and Caleb would head back to his truant ranger station. A subdued farewell passed between them. No fanfare, just a shared sense of accomplishment and a deeper understanding of what they'd experienced together. He arrived at the outpost by twilight. The building's wooden frame groaned in the wind, the same as always, but stepping inside felt strangely new. He hung his coat on the same peg, lit the same stove, brewed the same coffee, and yet the mood had shifted. The vacuum of silence that once filled every corner no longer seemed oppressive. Instead, it was restful, a moment to catch his breath. Boone, his old shepherd mix, greeted him with a wagging tail and curious sniff. Caleb knelt to pat the dog's head. "It's just us again," he murmured, but a faint smile curved his lips. Somehow, this solitude felt kinder, as if the memory of 3 wild Mustangs still lingered in the outpost's walls. The next morning, Caleb stepped outside to check on the old livestock pen behind the outpost, where the Mustangs had once huddled. New snowfall had partially erased their hoofprints, but in certain spots, a deeper indentation told the story of their presence. A stray strand of mane clung to a warped board, and a slight depression in the straw recalled where the younger Mustang had often rested. He walked around slowly, brushing snow off the rails. In one corner, he spotted a scrap of gauze, partly buried under a drift. He picked it up, shaking off the clinging crystals. A wave of inexplicable nostalgia washed over him. Just a piece of bandage, but I can't let it go. Tucking it into a small leather pouch, he exhaled softly. pausing in the middle of the pen. He closed his eyes. He could almost hear the faint snorts, the nervous stamping, the quiet trust they'd built day by day. It wasn't grief he felt. Not exactly. More like a gentle ache of missing something precious. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the snow, Caleb stood at the pen's old gate. In the fading orange light, the world felt still. He thought of the Mustangs, safe now on their journey. He thought of himself, no longer burdened by isolation. "They're gone," he murmured, "but I'm still here, and I'm alive in a way I haven't been for a long time." A sense of peace wrapped around him, tangible as the winter wind. Life carried on, and so would he, changed, but hopeful. 1 week passed in a quiet routine of gathering wood, tending the stove, and occasionally checking the radio for weather updates. Then, one chilly morning, Caleb heard a muffled sound outside. He opened the door to find a small package dropped by a passing ranger station courier. Inside was a letter from Eliza and a set of printed photos. He spread the photos across his small table, heart pounding. The images showed the 3 Mustangs at the recovery center. The younger horse now stood on all 4 legs, freed from bandages, its coat shining under midday sun. Another picture showed the adult mare trotting confidently in a fenced rehabilitation yard, while the newly rejoined stallion, once so frail, looked strong. Bony outlines filled in with fresh muscle. His mane, once clotted with ice, now glimmered in the light. Eliza's letter brimmed with details of their progress. The new diet, ongoing physical therapy, daily grooming sessions to rebuild trust. They had even integrated with a small group of rescued Mustangs, forming a close-knit subherd. Caleb's eyes flicked across each sentence, absorbing every shred of good news. Near the end of the letter came the real surprise. Eliza explained that if the weather held, the center planned to release the trio into the snowy range area in just 2 weeks. The final stage of their recovery involved reintroducing them to the wild that had once been their birthright. "Caleb," she wrote, "you're a part of their story now. They know you. If you can come, I'd be honored to have you there, to witness their return to freedom. I believe they'd recognize your presence, too." He read the paragraph twice, then folded the letter with shaky hands. 2 weeks. In that time, the snow would begin to melt around the lower slopes, giving the Mustangs open trails and fresh grazing land. For a moment, he pictured them galloping across a green hillside, a stark contrast to the day they'd arrived at his outpost, half frozen and desperate. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the letter against his chest. In the hush of the outpost, the only sound was the crackle of the stove. Slowly, he tucked the letter into an inside pocket of his jacket, a faint smile curving his lips. That afternoon, a brief shaft of golden sunlight broke through the gray clouds covering the canyon. Caleb stepped outside onto the rickety porch, Boone ambling behind him. The horizon stretched out, streaked with the faint promise of spring. Although snow still capped the peaks, he could see a thin line of exposed rock along one ridge, like a hint of renewal. He breathed in the crisp air, recalling the final lines of Eliza's letter. "They've gotten a second chance, and so have you." In that moment, he felt the warmth of the sun on his face, a gentle reassurance that winter's hold would eventually yield. The Mustangs were proof that survival led to new beginnings, if only you kept faith through the storm. Boone nudged his leg, breaking his reverie. Caleb chuckled, rubbing the dog's ears. "We'll go see them, pal," he murmured. "I owe them that, and maybe they owe me a few happy memories." A light breeze stirred the snow at his feet, carrying away the last echoes of silence. He looked out over the canyon, eyes bright with a hope he hadn't known for years. Yes, he thought, they got a second chance. I guess I did too. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.